This is a University of Otago podcast.
Talking, so we better start. We're starting very punctually, and that's good. We will be finished by 6:30. Shut up. What? I know this man. He's a troublemaker, a disruptor of meetings, aren't you? You nasty fellow. How do we get onto that? Okay, my name's Colin Campbell-Hunt. It's my privilege to very briefly welcome Metiria and David. A proper introduction will come from my co-chair, Janet Stevenson. So just a couple of words from me. First, to acknowledge the good work of my colleagues in the Otago Climate Change Network, from whom this idea emerged. Sarah Walton in particular, and to assure you that we have pleaded with, I believe there's one more party, isn't there? There are these two. There are several others, of course, but there was one that we thought was particularly important to invite as well. We did plead repeatedly. It's a shame they're not here, but what can you do? You know? So I'm going to hand over now immediately to my co-chair, Janet, who will say some other things. But before I do, Sir Alan Mark gave me this. There is a film called 2 Degrees, which is showing in the Archway Theatre 4, this building, on Monday, the 11th of August. And it's about the same stuff that we need to worry about. It's called 2 Degrees, curiously enough. And just put that in your diary, 11th of August, okay? And if you're interested, there's more information there. Janet, over to you.
Kia ora koutou. I'm Janet Stevenson. I'm the Director of the Centre for Sustainability, one of the 3 organisations that is co-hosting this event tonight. So Otago Climate Change Network is self-explanatory. It's a group of academics and others from across the university who are interested in climate change and often host events. The Otago Energy Research Centre also is co-hosting this, and OERC has a strong interest in the climate impacts of energy and energy use. And the Centre for Sustainability, we have an interest, of course, also in climate change, and I would suggest climate change is actually the issue of the 21st century, and so it's great to have so many people here tonight come to hear it debated or discussed, probably, more likely, by Labour and the Greens. And so I'd just like to welcome Metiria Turei, who is the co-leader of the Greens, as many of you know, and she's based here in Waitati. Lovely to have you here, Metiria. Metiria holds the Education Society and Māori Affairs portfolios with the Greens, but she has a broader interest in environmental issues and, of course, climate change. And David Clark, also another local, for those of you who don't know him, he's had a long association with Otago University, so it's lovely to have him here, and he's the MP for Dunedin North, and he is the spokesperson for revenue, small business, associate spokesperson for finance and health, but again, David also has a long interest in climate issues and in fact worked in policy in the government in this area for some time before he became an MP. So welcome to you both. The format for tonight is that each of these 2 good people will have 10 minutes to talk about their party's position on climate change and particularly on policies as to how New Zealand should be responding to climate issues. Following that, we have an opportunity for questions. Now, most of you will be aware that on the advertisement, we invited people to submit questions. Those questions will be have been sent to these 2, so they'll be ready to answer those. If we have time, we will also take questions from the floor. So, without further ado, I'd like to invite, who should we ask first? Okay.
Well done. Right.
It's great, actually. It's really nice being home and to see so many friendly faces in the audience too. So, all right. They used to call climate change the biggest issue of our time, but I think many of us might agree that it's actually the biggest issue of all time. As humans, we are in uncharted territory. Climate change is not a war, it's not a plague, it's not a global financial crisis. There is nothing to compare it to in human history, and we have no points of reference then for taking action. Because of this, understanding what we're seeing and taking action in response is a real challenge. In the last few years, in terms of climate change, we have begun to resemble some kind of bizarre sci-fi film, a mixture of towering inferno and, I don't know, some other one. Floods, wildfires, super typhoons, droughts. A recent report out from the UN found that disasters, including storms, floods and heat waves, have increased fivefold since the 1970s. Scientists say to brace for more and worse, including here in Aotearoa. Leading New Zealand scientist Andy Reisinger recently warned that our farmers in flood-hit communities may need to rethink where they live and work as climate change ramps up. Already local authorities in New Zealand are having to look at the likely effect of rising sea levels and increasing natural hazards, and at least here in Dunedin, the Dunedin City Council has identified these issues, identified the Harbourside and South City area as being vulnerable to sea level rise. A 0.3 metre sea level rise above 1990 levels is predicted by 2040. A 0.8 to 1.6 metre sea level rise could occur by the end of the century. Now, that's about as high as I am, right? I'm about 1.6. And I might not be that tall, actually, but if I were the sea level rise that we could expect, I would be way more formidable than I am now. Just think about what this means. The council is in the process of working through how it's going to deal with it. You would have seen the report in today's paper, and I fully endorse Ginty McTavish's call that the leadership failure is at the national level. Local councils are bearing the cost and they're doing as best as they can. They say time is money, and never more so than with climate change. The longer we delay, the more that we will pay. So we must take action. Standard & Poor's recently ranked New Zealand's sovereign credit rating as being described as one of the most vulnerable in the world because our cities are coastal and because agriculture takes up such a share of our economy. And yet the one person that we might expect who would be across these financial risks and the potential costs of climate change has stuck his head in the sand further than anybody actually in New Zealand. Earlier this month at a public meeting in Auckland, Finance Minister Bill English dismissed climate change as a non-issue and described climate mitigation as a luxury we can't afford. It's economically illiterate to class climate change mitigation as a luxury. It's going to harm our people. We must take action. We can't hide from climate change down here in the bottom of the world. We can't keep using our size as an excuse to do nothing. So, the National Party's favourite line is, we're only 0.2% of global emissions. What difference will it make, what we can do? But the nature of climate change is such that everyone's actions matter and everyone is affected by everybody else's actions. We can't expect other bigger countries to take action if we're not going to do it ourselves. On the other hand, we have this opportunity by demonstrating that transition to a clean economy is both rewarding and possible, and by doing so we can help to spur global action. So we can really lead on this issue. We're a can-do country. We're a country that's always said our size is not what matters, it's what we do. The thing about taking action on climate change, it's not just about avoiding disaster. It's also about seizing opportunities. So tackling climate change means moving to a smarter, greener economy, and by meeting the challenge of climate change, we can transform our economy and our society for the better. It's often said that New Zealand's unique emissions profile means that we're hamstrung. Well, the truth is every country has a unique emissions profile. Every country has unique challenges in dealing with climate change, and we can't continue to use our particular circumstances as an excuse to opt out. So the Green Party is the only party going into the election, so far at least, with a comprehensive plan to reduce emissions and to transition New Zealand to a truly low-carbon economy, all the while leaving households better off. I'll go into the details now, and then you might want to ask questions about this later on. In government, the Green Party will set a goal of carbon neutrality for New Zealand by 2050. So a net zero emissions economy by mid-century. Second, we'll establish an independent climate commission made up of climate science and policy experts. Now, this commission will advise government on national carbon budgets and the best practice to meet them. And thirdly, we'll scrap the failed emissions trading scheme and introduce a carbon tax on pollution. Every dollar that is raised from the carbon tax on pollution will go back to New Zealand households and to businesses in the form of a climate tax cut. The charge for carbon will initially be set at $25 a tonne on CO2 equivalent emissions for all sectors except for agriculture. Dairy emissions will pay $12.50 a tonne, and forestry will be credited at $12.50 a tonne. All of the revenue raised from the carbon charge, from the carbon tax, will go back to families and businesses. First through a $2,000 income tax-free band for all income earners and a 1% tax cut for all businesses. So in general, New Zealand households will be about $320 better off a year on average once the tax is introduced, and that's after factoring the likely increased costs of fuel and transport. So Bill did some work for us looking at what the cost increases of a carbon tax might be, and then how we could best offset those increases. A carbon tax on pollution is straightforward. It's honest, it's transparent. It has none of the smoke and mirrors and the potential for abuse that we're seeing actually play out right now of the emissions trading scheme. And finally, we'll introduce a suite of complementary measures to support the rapid transition to a carbon neutral economy. Things like the Green Investment Bank that we announced in May, our solar homes and solar schools programs that we've just announced last week, 100% renewable electricity, and of course the extra $1 billion for R&D that we've announced as well. How we respond to climate change will define us as a country and as a people. So the Greens are the only party to commit to transitioning our economy to being carbon neutral, to being clean and safe and smart and prosperous. We'll foster greener jobs and greener businesses, and we won't allow households to bear the cost of that pollution. We are responding to the threat of global climate change, and we're turning it into an opportunity for New Zealand's innovation. And the failure to do any less, in our view, is a betrayal of our children and our grandchildren and our beautiful country. Kia ora.
Well, kia ora koutou. And thank you for coming out this evening to discuss this incredibly important topic. And kia ora to Metiria. It's nice to be back on the platform again. I think this is the first debate/discussion where we've been in this position this time round. I want to talk a little bit about why I care about this issue, and because you won't all know my background and history, so apologies to those who do. And no apology to those who don't. I got into politics not very long ago, and primarily because I'm concerned about the growing inequalities in our society. That's what's really made me passionate about getting involved. I want to make some difference in that respect. The gap between rich and poor is getting wider and wider, and I think that that is a direct result of government decision making. Climate change is an issue that has inequality at its core. The costs, the negative costs associated with climate change are borne unequally by the poorest members of our society, who are the least mobile and the least able to afford to buy land, for example, in areas that are above sea level rise, that are the least able to make the changes to shower heads, light bulbs, all those kinds of things as power prices go up. It's also an intergenerational issue where the costs of climate change are borne unequally across generations. The choices that we have made and previous generations have made are being borne and will be borne in large part by future generations. I'm not a believer in peak oil. I think that there is enough fossil fuel to cook the planet many, many times over. And I have a fear that that is the path we are on. I think it's undeniable that that is the path we are on. I believe we might have got through most of the cheap oil, although new technologies are coming on stream all the time, and the oil industries are very confident about their prospects currently. So that's a bit of background. I'm being completely upfront with you about where I'm coming from. To me, this is an issue that is borne by future generations. If we don't address it now entirely, they won't exist. The planet will carry on. It will carry on quite happily without us. And we, as a species, will die out unless we address climate change. I worked on the emissions trading scheme, so there's my other card on the table. I helped design it. I worked in Treasury on climate change policy before I looked at politics and long before I ran for a political party. I went to international negotiations and saw the futility and frustration that goes with that process. And also some of the gains that can be won through those international negotiations. I saw them up front. And I was very proud of the fact that the last Labour government put through the first all-sectors, all-emissions trading scheme in the world. It was the first, and with the help of the Greens, we got through the first all-sectors, all-gases emissions trading scheme in the world. And it was fantastic. It was a start. But what that has turned into under the current government is a guarantee for polluters. And that is not what it was intended to be. It is actually now giving certainty to polluters to carry on polluting. And that needs to change. I also want to say a few things about the Greens carbon tax policy, and I think it's good to be having the discussion and the debate about which is the best solution, because I think we're agreed that action needs to happen, and what we're debating about is the best way for that action to happen and the fastest way and the most sustainable way for that action to happen. Sir Nicholas Stern's review that came out in 2006, 700-page tome, makes the argument very clearly, and I think puts the matter to bed, that it's a lot cheaper, more effective, socially just, and so on, to address climate change up front. Address the costs up front. The costs are so much smaller of addressing climate change now than dealing with the consequences down the track. So we agree on the principle, and what we're debating about is which is the best way to get there. I'm very suspicious of the benefits of a carbon tax, and that is, I'm always very suspicious of anything put forward by the Business Roundtable. Forgive me, that is one of my prejudices. They have been one of the big advocates for a carbon tax in the past, and there are two reasons for that, in my view. One is that a carbon tax is politically difficult to get through. We've tried in New Zealand, and we've failed. They know that while we will be having that debate and that consultation, which takes time, nothing will happen. And they also know that a carbon tax is easily reversed. An emissions trading scheme is not easily reversed. It's just happened in Australia, right? Gone. Just like that. An emissions trading scheme in New Zealand cannot be got out of so easily, and the current government, trust me, would have got out of it if they could. But there are foresters who have carbon credits. And there are jobs dependent on the current emissions trading scheme. There is a market, albeit not a very functional one, and certainly not as good as we would like to see. And so I think that there is real merit in having an emissions trading scheme, both from the fact that it's easier to ramp up an emissions trading scheme straight away. It doesn't require a significant change in policy. The policy settings can be adjusted easily. And also for the sustainability of the policy across governments. Future governments cannot renege from the responsibilities that have already been signed up to. And we could also get into the detail. I mean, the current scheme when properly implemented, is all sectors, all gases. The green scheme, as I understand it, is in the agricultural sector restricted to dairying. And then, there are a whole lot of grey areas in that. It's difficult when it comes to farms that are of mixed use. You've got cattle and sheep. Is that you're not measuring the emissions of those cattle? Well, they're the same cattle in the paddock next door that's on a dairy farm. As it is with any tax. I'm not picking holes in this one. Any tax, I'm our tax spokesperson. I get to deal with these frustrations on a daily basis. There are loopholes in any trading scheme. And my view is that the challenge is to close those loopholes. There are loopholes in any tax system, and the challenge is to plug those loopholes. So I certainly don't see the two as one being a pure scheme and one being a mixed scheme. They are both schemes that will have loopholes and that will need to be plugged wherever we head as a country. I want to talk a little bit about our policy in terms of the emissions units. We want to make the scheme we want to make it a requirement that 50% of the units in the scheme are New Zealand units. We know that behaviour was changed significantly when our scheme was up and running in its first period of operation. People did plant forests. They knew that when there was a price on carbon, it was well worth their while investing in things that were good for the planet. The other thing I guess I want to say is that there are a whole range of benefits, and Metiria's touched upon this. There are public health gains from having policies which are climate friendly, from insulation, from policies that support cycling and walking. I'm a cyclist. I'm going to support them, but we all know that there are public health gains to be had from those things. There are economic gains when we incentivise getting onto new technology and the development of new technology. We can lead the world in many climate mitigation technologies, and we know that we have already in some areas, and we could do a whole lot more if we incentivised. We know that there are environmental benefits. So, for example, waterways, changing the way we use our land, making it a requirement that intensification is only done where, as we've said, where the treatment of the surrounding environment is improved, not accepted that it will get worse with any intensification. Putting the burden of proof on the other foot, if you like. And I've talked about intergenerational equity. And then there's biosecurity issues as well, and climate refugees and all kinds of other things that come from runaway climate change that can be avoided, that can cause international conflict. We know about the flooding in Bangladesh that will be rapidly increased as time goes by, natural disasters increased, extreme climates, and so on. All of that stuff, There is nothing carbon tax can do that an emissions trading scheme can't do. And in fact, many of the parts of the emissions trading scheme currently behave a lot like a tax. So in the transport sector, the way that fuel is charged at point of obligation is effectively like a tax. So in many ways these are very similar ways of going about things. The National Party, I think I touched on this already, but they have effectively been wedged by the existing emissions trading scheme that Labor put forward with the support of the Greens, and they cannot get out of it now. I don't want to let them off the hook. Iwi are desperate for the emissions trading scheme to be kept because they've invested heavily in forestry, and the 12.5%, I think is the Greens policy credit per tonne, is a lot less than they would be expecting from a market return. So they are deeply concerned about the prospect of a tax, and I think we'll all agree that iwi are pretty important to the future of our country, and their investments in climate-friendly technologies need to be rewarded and supported. And to close off, I think I just want to say that I've already made the point about an emissions trading scheme being in place now. It's not on the never. It's not something that will need to be worked through. We've got one. We just need to ramp up, bring agriculture into the scheme, which we will do from 2016 onwards. We've given that clear signal. It's about giving clear signals. It's about encouraging businesses to make decisions that are friendly on the environment because they know that there is a cost of carbon coming, and we can achieve that through ensuring that we have a high portion of the units being New Zealand units, because there will be a high demand for those units. I think a lot of the other things will be covered off as we go through. Population growth, I would say again, inequalities. Wealth is one of the best contraceptives we know. That is true at a local level, and that's true at an international level. When we address inequalities, we actually address population growth. And so policies and the parties that have policies to ensure that everyone has some security and that they know that their children will have opportunities actually supports climate change objectives as well. So I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I'd rather hand over to questions and have an interaction, because I think that's probably the most engaging way to go about things. But thank you for having us here. I am disappointed in closing that we don't have other parties represented here. Metiria and I have discussed that. It's probably a very effective political strategy. I don't think they walked away unwounded last time round. But it is disappointing because this, as Metiria said, is the biggest issue of all time. And when people don't turn up to the biggest issue of all time, we have a real problem.
Wonderful. Janet and I were saying, look, they're politicians, they're going to take longer than 10 minutes, but they didn't. It's wonderful. So what we're going to start with here is the questions that were sent in prior to this evening, and I'm sure many of you have questions of your own you want to ask, but in fairness to the people who, actually wrote some emails, you idle bastards, we'll start with that.
And because this is being live streamed, I'll read the questions out aloud so that anybody who's in the live streaming audience knows what they are. Starting with the first one, is the person who actually wrote the question in the audience? No, right, okay. What it says is, will the divesting of energy company stocks really help the planet reach greener energy goals sooner? So I'd like to invite our two politicians to comment on that.
So let's not, there's not going to be any single silver bullet. We're going to have to do a whole lot of different things, and this is one of those. One of the advantages, I think, is it helps to stigmatise those companies and what they do, and that it provides to the public some leadership over what's acceptable and what's not. If you're talking about government agencies or government funds divesting from energy company stocks, it sends a very strong message to the public that the public will collectivise via the state, says it's not acceptable. And for the same way that you would divest from weapons companies, for example, or from tobacco companies or from alcohol companies, divesting from these companies would be a very important social step, as well as having some quite minor, but still some effect on them economically. It's also been one that's been recommended by the World Bank president, for example. There's been studies from Oxford about the impact and the usefulness of this divestment. So I think it is one of the things that we should be doing, along with a number of other things.
Yep, I agree. It's happening more and more, and that's a good thing. I don't think on its own it will do a great deal, but it's the stigmatising effect that it has that's of benefit. The thing that, there are other things that will make a really, really big concrete difference now. The biofuel sales obligation that the last Labor government brought in gave certainty to businesses that they could produce, if they could produce biofuel in a sustainable way from waste products, not food sources, and we had examples, they would invest in machinery now, get on with it, start that process happening, and get it into fuels and get it accepted that it's perfectly okay and adequate and it works elsewhere. Instead, what we've seen is those companies leaving New Zealand. There are really concrete steps we can take that will change behaviours and change the way things are.
bright ideas as we go along. I just wondered if, we've got lots of questions here, and I'm sure you're full of them. I don't want to cut you off. So I wonder if there's anybody in the room who asked one of these. Hands up. Yes, right. Why don't you ask yours, my friend? Tell us which one it is. The bottom one. Okay, Janet, go.
Great. The bottom one says, is it more effective being in government versus opposition benches? And if yes, supplementary question, why rule out a partnership with National? Surely Green national government would be more effective at dealing with climate issues than a National only or National/Colin Craig. I think we know who has to answer
Does that include
this.
the possibility of a grand coalition? You can do more when you're in government than when you're out. That doesn't mean you can't do, but you can also do a great deal when you're out of government. Out of government, the Greens brought in a 300 and something million home insulation scheme. We worked it through with Labor. When we were not in government with them, we got National to agree to it at the next election after. We weren't in government with them either. It has been a significant contributor to the well-being of families, and extended, as we have announced that we would extend it, will make a contribution to emissions, but more importantly to the health of our families. So there's a lot you can do in opposition. The difficulty, of course, working with National, and we have worked with them with the MOU on cleaning up of toxic sites and the home insulation and the National Cycleway, is that if to be in government with them, they would need to change a great deal of what they're intending to do. They don't behave particularly well when it comes to treating people with justice or treating our environment with respect. In fact, they are very much geared towards a pollution economy. So if they were intending to significantly, quite radically alter their program, who knows what might have been the case, but they won't. And so there's no sense in us being part of a national government that is at its heart a pollution-driven policy, that at its heart wants to increase the degradation of our environment for the benefit of a few, that at its heart has no compassion for the most vulnerable families in this country. So that makes it very difficult then to consider being in a government with them, which is why we've said it's highly unlikely. That doesn't mean that we can't work with them where we have areas of common concern, and we've shown that we can do that, but they are narrow areas because National is so destructive. And I would say to you, another 3 years of National government will see a significant increase in our emissions, given that we're talking here about climate change, significant increase in the degradation and risk to our environment, particularly through deep sea oil drilling, for example. It is not a risk that this country can afford.
Yeah, no thanks. We tend to have ruled that possibility out more strictly than the Greens in the past. I guess things like the minimum wage policies and other things we find very difficult to live with. The environmental policy we find impossible. The first thing another thing I worked on was the thermal ban on new baseload generation. Now, all that did, there was no economic case for new baseload generation in thermal energy, but it gave certainty. And they just pulled that out as a political stunt, basically. And that shows where they're at. That's the disdain. And the Greens, I think, to their credit, have tried to work constructively for all those things. And Metiria might not say this, but toward the end, I think they were treated unfairly and with disdain by the national government. And that, that's despite I think repeated efforts by the Greens to try and make some progress. They want to leverage the brand of coalitions and getting on with others, but there is no substance to backing that up, to actually delivering on the kind of needs of the most vulnerable citizens. And so that's an incredibly frustrating place to be. I think that working together is a great ideal. We've written to the National Party to talk about RMA and other reforms and saying, well, let's work on these things. Let's see if we can't find something that we can agree on that actually gets closer to where we'd like to be on things. They don't want to know. They've got the numbers, and that's the answer. We've got the numbers. We don't want to talk to you, and that's the unfortunate reality. It doesn't stop us trying, and it hasn't stopped the Greens trying. But when the door's shut, you can't go through it. You can keep hitting your head against the wall, and we do, but you still can't get through it.
Thank you. Now, Colin and I have been making up the rules as we go along, and new rule. We're going to alternate questions from the floor with these questions here, with the remaining questions on the board. So, and Colin, I believe, is going to be the runner, or maybe Dan. And so, first hand up, we'll get the question. Young woman there with the red jersey on.
You've got a bad knee too. Who's first? You're first. It's green. That's probably good.
Better than blue. My name's Saskia. I've just got a bit of background. I actually went to the COP last year in Warsaw with one of the youth delegations, so I've got a bit of background, and I'm doing my research this year on youth participation at COP. So it's a kind of two questions. First one is, how do your party support youth delegates going to international conferences such as COP in an official capacity? And the second one is, given the current situations and negotiations with pledges and commitments for reductions of mitigation targets, what difference will your parties make if they come into government this year?
In terms of supporting youth delegations, we provide lots of moral support. You will probably know, and I'd be interested to hear if it's any different for the Greens, but a lot of our work is funded from local donations. So anyone wanting to buy a raffle ticket before they leave, please speak to me. And that goes for including our national advertising when it comes to election time. That's all funded out of local pockets. And you'll see it on the election returns when you come and have a look after the election. The money goes from National Party head office out to the local candidates. In the Labour Party, it goes from local candidates into head office, reflecting the fact that our fundraising is done on the ground and we're a grassroots party, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Greens had a similar pattern. In terms of, sorry, what was the second leg to your question was? Mitigation targets. We and I think Metiria said that it's Greens policy as well, we want to bring in carbon budgeting. So we want to have a clear picture of what the implications of any new policies are and set a budget over time. And we want independent advice on that, so we are actually getting toward carbon targets. Now, I embarrassingly don't know what exactly that target is. Do you know what your target is? What percentage of carbon reduction over time? I should know. I should know the answer. There's a lot of Labour Party people in the audience. Can someone give me some help here? We had in our last policy when we were last in government, we had a clear reduction path, and you work from from what's possible, and then you work back and say, how do we get there? That's the answer. So you need independent advice, and you need a carbon budget, and that's the Greens have also, I think, said they want a carbon budget as well, an independent assessment.
Yeah, I'm not really up with the lingo. We are committed to net zero emissions by 2050. So, insofar as we need to get there, we need a plan. That's why we want to set up the commission. There's a whole lot of stuff that the commission can do, which is actually designed to look at all of those policy details and work through the plan. Yeah, so that we can't. And it's an independent commission. It will have a similar kind of role as the Parliamentary Commission for the Environment. So it will report to Parliament, but it is not working for a government department. So it is independent from the government agencies, and its job is to develop these plans that then government will be, we would hope, would be expected to put in place. And the reason for that is that we just aren't experts on our own. We need to actually pull the experts in and deal with the real science, but also the policy expertise on how to make these steps real and just as well. Because I know David raised the issue around our policy of foresters, for example, and we need to make sure that at each step of the way we aren't causing any unnecessary harm to either industry or to families, to iwi, for example. So we need to be able to step that plan up. In terms of Global Young Greens, we are part of the Global Greens network, and so the MPs individually contribute funding to the Global Greens, which then help with the Global Young Greens getting going to these conferences. And I think we've had Young Greens from New Zealand go as well, so we do our best to make sure that we resource as we can, but as David said, we fund similarly in a kind of community way. But our Global Greens network is the primary help, if I remember rightly. So,
Great. Now, back to the board. Okay. I think we'll ask the one about energy companies. So what role do you see for multinational energy companies like Shell, BP, Chevron and OMV in transitioning to greener energy sources on the planet?
So we've announced there's two things. One is the green. I'm not saying that this is how they contribute, but our two policy announcements in recent times have been the Green Investment Bank, which is using resources, particularly from the mining industry, in order to provide an initial start to a green investment fund that will fund sustainable and renewable alternatives. This is about making these industries pay for the transition, not about these industries themselves being resourced to make the transition. And I think that's important that we make that distinction. The R&D announcement that we made of $1 billion over a number of years R&D investment for this purpose as well is not designed to be given to coal companies who want to try to do clean coal. It will be for genuine alternatives to the fossil fuel industry. So really, we are thinking about the next transition period, trying to find ways of extracting, of making sure that these companies are paying their fair share, because many of them are not now, and then using that funding to make the transition to the next stage by investing in other kinds of industries and other kinds of sustainable business. So that's the role that we have set out for them. Whether or not they themselves will see the business opportunities in renewables and sustainable technologies and make that investment themselves is their business. But from our point of view, we're not interested in investing in these companies in order to get them to make the transition. We actually need to be investing in other new technologies to do that. So,
yep. And Metiria's hit on the right point with transition. We think a proper price on carbon, which results from either an emissions trading scheme or a carbon tax, changes behaviour. And if I can tell a little story, I understand Z and BP have done some things in that direction, and I want to say some of the companies are better than others, but they all respond to financial incentives in the end. But I can remember, and I'm going to tell the story because I think it's outrageous. When I was working on the emissions trading scheme, I had to ring up the different companies who were affected by these things and the different stakeholders and the different policy areas, transport, agriculture, business, and so on. And I will never forget ringing up Mobil and saying, I'm ringing up to talk to you about the point of obligation and get your take on the policy as we're putting it forward. And the guy on the other end of the phone said, you do realise you're talking to Mobil, don't you? We don't care. And I was just blown away. He as far as climate change was concerned, that was their response. So that may have been a few years ago. Personnel may have changed, but I just don't find that excusable and acceptable. So some companies, and at that stage, other companies were interested to listen. They wanted to engage on the biofuels obligation. They wanted to engage on other things that were in the future, the financial incentives, where the point of obligation was, designing a scheme that enabled a transition away from fossil fuel dependence. But some companies don't care.
Right, back to the audience. Yes. I think young people get a precedence here. That's fine. You go. You're not as young as some, but you're young enough. Oh, is it one of these? Well, ask it then.
Okay, so like David, I really don't think we're going to hit people. Sorry. Like David, I really don't think. Do I need to have my mic on? Record me? Yeah.
No, it's okay. I know this one. It's horrible talking into them. I don't think we're going to hit peak oil. I think we will just continue to find nastier resources, right? I'd like to think that the society contains a whole bunch of people who are going to see that we need to make some changes in our lives in order to live through climate change or whatever. And I also don't really think that's the majority are going to do that spontaneously of their own accord, make their lives more difficult in order to save the earth. So I was hoping that both of you could outline for me some aspects of your party's policies that will perhaps gently guide society to change its behaviour in a way that's going to mitigate the impacts of climate change.
Well, I agree, and I actually don't think gentle is the answer. I personally think that having a proper price on carbon is what makes the change. People do respond to financial incentives, and again, if I can be slightly critical of the Greens policy, and we can have this debate, the carbon tax cut I think is a bit regressive, because if you're a double income, no kids family in central Auckland, you don't use a lot of power. If you've got 5 kids and you're in Southland in the countryside and you're cold, you've got a whole lot of bad health outcomes that come with that. But that's, we can debate that backwards and forwards. The important thing is that you have a price and that you are driving behaviour through price, and also that you have politicians willing to stand up and say this matters. And that's what I don't see coming from the current government. I don't see them acknowledging climate change. I see them shuffling feet. I see them not turning up to debates currently. And in Parliament, I see them, the official spokespeople, talking about how, New Zealand can't really afford this and can't afford that, and, we're only a small person and it won't make any difference, and so on. Well, that's not actually fronting up. I think you need moral leadership, and I think you need a hard price on carbon.
I agree we need a hard price on carbon. That's why we've announced our carbon tax policy. The thing is, there's lots of different things you need to do. So the carbon tax policy that recycles it into a tax-free band is one way of helping reduce the effects of increased costs on a family. We also have NZ Power, which is designed to reform the electricity industry to again reduce power bills for families. We also have a proposal for progressive pricing on electricity, which has the impact of assisting again families and incentivising them to reduce their power use, because they will see that reduction in their power bills and have money in their back pocket at the same time. A national food strategy to help New Zealand to develop greater self-sufficiency in food production, with a priority for that self-sufficiency. The solar homes program, which is another way of starting. It's a small program to start with, but it, like home insulation, is a step towards incentivising solar on homes, and therefore over time reducing power bills and enabling again greater self-sufficiency for families. The same with schools, with our solar schools. The home insulation program, which again is seeing both benefits in energy, but particularly in the health and well-being of families. So there is no single thing that's going to make everything better. We have to do lots of different bits, increasing wages, increasing benefits to reduce poverty, because that goes a long way towards giving families better choices about the energy that they use, for example, even down to the kinds of heaters they may choose to use. So some of it, in my view, all of the incentives and support for changing behaviour at a family level, at a household level, need to be looking very closely at household budgets and where are the little things that we can do to help households make that shift in their behaviour. Information, it needs to be available to them as well. There's a whole lot of things at that level. And then the regulatory level, at the hard end, is where you get to industry, because industry are the ones who are responsible for a great deal of this. So you have to leave your hardest hitting, if you like, proposals to those industries who can take the hit and who do need to be genuinely pushed to making change. So that's where I would put the balance. And I think that the Greens, that's why we have this whole range of complementary measures. It's why we have this whole focus on families and all the different small ways that we can help them make those shifts. I think that's the only way we can do it. Let's bear in mind, I just want to say, just bear in mind, we've had a big shift in the last 10 years. Like, I've been in Parliament 12 years now. When I first came to Parliament, there wasn't a single taxi company in this country who had a bloomin' Prius, let alone taxi companies now who are advertising on the basis that they are have fancy cars that reduce emissions and electric cars and electric motors. In the last 10 years, last 10 to 12 years, there has been an incredible shift in the New Zealanders' consciousness around what it means to be more sustainable in their households. They have done a huge amount, and we need to be really supportive of those shifts. Gardens, for example, gardens are now a sign of modernity, not retro. Well, they're kind of retro in a more famous way now. So people are making a genuine shift in their lives, and we as a government, which we expect to be after September 20, we as a government can do a great deal to help reward that shift in order to help encourage further shifts. That's where I think we need to be focused.
Right. Well, I was just looking at actually the second top question, but I think we've really touched on health quite well. Yes. Yeah. I'd quite like to throw it back to the audience actually for our last 7 minutes or so. So who would?
It's my turn.
Yes.
No, it is this side.
There's a
What
young
do I do with
up
you
there in the
people?
middle.
Well, yes. Would you like to shoot each other or what? Well, you're a gentleman.
My question is actually in response to the answer we just got. In terms of being sensitive to inequality, I'm reasonably concerned with almost a user pays system. How is it going to be avoided that those who can afford green options, which are the middle income earners generally, upward, how is it going to be avoided that they are the ones that avoid the stigma of not going green, and yet the lower income people who are really struggling even just to pay that power bill, let alone go solar, how are they going to be helped to go green?
Well, I think Metiria touched on that with raising wages and so on. I really think that a big part of that solution is in making sure that families have the income they need. Our Best Start policy involves more early childhood education being free. It involves $60 a week more in the pocket of the average family with a young child. It involves making sure that there's longer paid parental leave, and so on. Those are all parts of the puzzle. Raising minimum wages, supporting a living wage, actively changing the gap, the Gini coefficient, getting down to that level, making sure that we are making sure that everybody has their basic needs met, means exactly as Met said, that people then have the ability to choose the right answer for our planet, because I actually think most people want to. I don't think it's a lack of want to, but at the moment it is the wealthiest who can afford to. One of the concerns I have, for example, is about distributed generation. Right now, those who can afford solar, a lot of people are investing because they can afford the upfront cost. Their power bills go down, and over time they're actually better off. But there's a lot of poorer households who cannot afford that upfront investment. Now, as more and more wealthy households go off the grid, that means more and more poorer households are sharing the cost of that grid. And you end up with a growing inequality in terms of access to electricity, which is a basic household need. So that's all by way of saying that's the right question. And I think some of the answer lies in making sure that we're actually bringing those at the bottom up to an appropriate level of income so that they can actually participate fairly and fully in that decision making.
Okay, I'll be quick. Can I be quick? Absolutely. Like I say, we can. The issues around improving the incomes and the circumstances for families at the bottom end, and we're talking about 50% of the population actually. 50% of the population have not seen any rise in their circumstances in the last 6 years under National. Right, 50%. That's a hell of a lot of people. That is middle New Zealand. So We know that everybody is doing it hard, which is why you have all the social policy built around families and I've talked about some of that stuff. That can't be a reason not to take action on climate change. We have to be able to do both. And that's why you need to do both in a careful and considered way. Make sure that you've got the steps in place. You are reviewing each of those steps as you go. So you're making sure you're really conscious about where any harm could be caused or who is bearing the cost, and then you take measures to reduce that wherever possible, which is why when we did the carbon tax, we said that it would be recycled back into a tax-free band, which is a very progressive tax. It has a more significant effect for those who are on lower incomes than those who are on higher incomes. So you continue with a progressive tax policy over time as well. You continue with the social supports. You continue with taking action on climate change, because all of these things have to work together. That's what makes for a kind of an intelligent and progressive society, is that we are able to do all of those things at the same time, take care of each other as we go, but work towards a really clear goal. So I just would say that that's not... It is thought through how we do it, but we cannot avoid taking action on climate change.
Thank you. Now we've got time for one more question, and we'll let Dan choose who's taking that.
Oh, no way. Yes, I got the question. Thank you.
It's been great. There's so many women asking questions. It's really good. It's really good.
I'm a former teacher, a former scientist, now studying my master's in the interdisciplinary nature of climate change. Now, you both have been very eloquent, and I really do like your policies, but you're only talking about top-down policies. You're talking about centralised policies. You're not talking about things which I think would cause the most momentum and the most shift in community, which is public education. From my experience, yes, the last 10 years has seen a change, but where are your public education policies? I'm not seeing anything other than osmosis. Yes, carbon tax is important, but could we hear about something other than carbon tax for the moment, please?
Sure. This is education for sustainability. The Green Party got significant funding with Labour in 2005 for a major increase in the rollout of education for sustainability across primary and intermediate and secondary schools. Was one of the best, and it's still continuing in some form, but not with the strength that it had with Labour and the Greens. And it did a number of things. One, it provided support for schools. It also provided expert teachers inside teachers' colleges as well, and the universities. And that had a significant impact then on the relationship between the schools and families on issues around sustainability, and climate change is part of that. So what you're building with that program, and we would reinvest in it significantly again, is a generation, or continuing generations of people who understand their relationship with the natural world, what it means to be responsible for the natural world, how to both take care of it and how it takes care of you, and how to organise as groups around collective decision making. The children, for example, we've had, that I talked to over a number of years, had councils where they managed their waste as a group of children, making decisions about the waste that was allowed in the schools, energy audits that they were doing, engagement with their local wetlands and lakes, and in terms of just direct engagement with their natural environment. So, and then work in the secondary schools to make that relevant to the NCEA, so that young people were able to see that they could have that knowledge was valuable for them in their future careers and what they might want to do with their lives. So it was a way to start that genuine public education. So not just saying to people, if you put, things around your window, you have less leaks. Not that. I mean, that's one kind of education, but you need a much deeper level of education about your relationships with the natural world and with each other, and how to make decisions, which is what Education for Sustainability did and would do better with more resources.
The Enviro Schools program had a very real effect. I mean, one of the ways if people want to educate themselves is to talk to kids. It's amazing. Like when I was at Selwyn College, which was my last job running on college on campus, the students coming through were well ahead of where the rest of society was. Well ahead. well ahead, and they are educating us now, even still. And look at the stuff that sorry. Gen Zero, thank you. You're exactly what I was looking for. I mean, look at what Gen Zero's done. I mean, and that group are the people who are affected longer term by it, as are we all, and they are doing the job of educating us. I think, and I'll go back to what Metiria said at the start, local council here has been taking a lead on, sussing out what's going on in South Dunedin. I know that our spokesperson has gone and talked to the mayor and said, look, as plans develop, we want to be a part of it. We recognise it's actually going to take more than a local response, and I think we've both spoken about the lack of central government leadership. Our role is as central government. What would we do and what should we do? I think from bottom up, there's a lot going on, and it's actually that central government's not responding to it as well as it ought to be. Yeah.
Climate voter.
Yep.
And getting out, enrolling, and making sure you vote. You've got 3 weeks you can vote. Remember, voting starts on 3rd September now. Voting starts on the 3rd of September, this election period. You can vote any time between 3rd of September and the 20th. Climate Voter is the other major campaign that gives you the information you need about climate change issues and how they're relevant to this election. Make sure that we get a change of government. That's the only way we're going to get real action. Kia ora.
That was a political statement, I think.
Kia ora.
Wasn't it? Yeah.